We have two more speakers this morning. I think that a common denominator for the two speakers I've been asked to introduce is scientific versatility. They both apply a wide range of methods to understand our oceans. So let's start with Ric Williams. Ric is a professor at the University of Liverpool. His scientific interests are at the nexus of multiple fields, including ocean dynamics, carbon cycling, nutrient limitation of phytoplankton, ocean heat uptake, and climate change. In addition to many influential papers, Ric has co-authored with Mick Follows an outstanding textbook titled Ocean Dynamics and the Carbon Cycle, Principles and Mechanisms. And today, Ric will talk about physical controls on the air-sea partitioning of CO2.
Always pleased to get a plug for the book. So what I'd like to do today is talk about how the Southern Ocean might be important in the carbon system, but also the wider climate system. I have to do a big thank you to Mick Follows. Many of these ideas I first developed with Mick, and then part of the work with John Lauderdale, who is here, and the climate implications is work I've done with Phil Goodwin. So in many ways, I think we've had some great introductory overviews. Mike providing an observational context, and I feel somewhat embarrassed about the lack of constraining observations we can put to this part of the problem, and that has to be part of the rationale behind this whole workshop. And Andy has nicely set out a residual mean view, but also mentioned the caveats to that. So I want to really take that further forward and think about the implications of those ideas for nutrient and carbon transfers, and really also bring in questions about the wider implications. Oh, is this not? So how I want to run this today is I want to focus on providing a mechanistic view and just make some first order, rather simple statements about what is probably going on. And I really want to emphasize the use of different frameworks to unravel either the behavior of models or to interpret the available observations. I will be emphasizing the residual circulation, but I am fully aware of the caveats that have been touched on in the discussions, that a zonally averaged view for volume won't necessarily translate into how other traces and properties are transferred. And I want to end with some global implications of the ideas about how the entire ocean is operating, but I think the Southern Ocean is particularly important there for our climate system, which is outside probably the main remit of the meeting, but I think it's potentially important work. So Andy very much emphasized this, physical view of the system, and of course the challenge now is to think about how does that carry over for the carbon and nutrient parts of the system. So let's start off for basics. Of course, as we all know, we've got the air-sea transfer of CO2, and the CO2 reacts within the seawater, forming the carbonate and bicarbonate ions. And so only about 0.5% of the dissolved inorganic carbon is in this aqueous CO2 form. But that is affecting the air-sea transfer. And that then is leading to the fact there's 50 to 70 times as much carbon locked up in the ocean as there is in the atmosphere. But what's important here, there's a complexity here, that as we add more carbon, we alter the concentration of the hydrogen ions, and the system reacts to that. It actually reduces the amount of carbonate and increases the amount of the aqueous CO2, and that inhibits the subsequent uptake of anthropogenic carbon by the ocean. And that's a first order effect on the system. And that acidity feedback is also encapsulated in this buffer factor, which is saying the fractional changes of atmospheric CO2 are larger than that of the dissolved inorganic carbon. So why is that? Obviously, that's important for the chemistry, but it feeds back into affecting the air-sea transfer. The air-sea transfer, we can write down a rate of change for the dissolved inorganic carbon. That's going to be driven by the differences in partial pressure affected by the transfer velocity and the mixed layer thickness. But if you work out the time scale for this air-sea transfer, that's going to be given by, just from a scaling argument, the mixed layer depth divided by this transfer velocity. And you would think at face value it was given then by a ratio of these concentrations. But this acidity feedback comes into play. And so a time scale, so that then leads to the time scale. If it was for a gas like oxygen or heat, the time scale would probably be a month. If carbon was non-reactive, it would be 200 times longer than that. But because of this acidity feedback and the increased variations of CO2, it means the equilibration timescale is typically of order a year. So that immediately has some implications into how we understand the system, and we use our insight of how, say, heat is transferred or oxygen is transferred. We have to modulate that because of the degree at which we transfer those ideas over because of this time scale. So very simply, for the physical part of the system, we're dealing with waters being cold waters being entrained up and warmed, and these carbon-rich waters are then outgassing linked to that warming. And then somewhere else over the globe, there's a cooling and a CO2 uptake. And so you could argue that the rate-limiting process, what we're concerned about is the mismatch, really, between these two processes. And I would argue, just because on basis of the timescales, we should be interested in terms of what are the rate-limiting processes on annual timescales. And my view is that it surely then is due to this mismatch, the mismatch between what is entrained up into the winter mixed layer and what then is subducted into the main thermocline. And that then is effectively controlling the air-sea uptake. I would argue that whilst as our resolutions improve, we're seeing more and more fine structure and glory in terms of the underlying physics. For this part of the problem, though, I would say the fine-scale dynamical processes are only important in terms of how they're modulating these two processes. For the biology, a similar sort of first-order view. We're having carbon-rich waters being entrained into the mixed layer. And so where there's a CO2 influx, we're having an outflux there because of the carbon-rich waters are being brought up. And in this case, at some point, they'll linked to biological utilization, there'll be a drawdown. Now, I think the biological part of the system can respond to the very fine-scale physics, linked with the upwelling and frontal circulations, particularly, arguably, in terms of the delivery of trace metals. Ultimately, of course, what's important here for the biology is the effect on the underlying dissolved organic carbon profile. It's not just about the bulk transfers. So the underlying profile of carbon, the biology, I think, is very important in determining. So the prevailing view here is the biological response is probably not the first order process for anthropogenic responses, but is crucial at longer time scales. But I'm not sure that we've tested that prevailing view carefully enough. So in terms of the mechanisms, the first order view is that often we'll be seeing opposing signs linked to some of the physical and biological responses in the system. So to try and unravel some of this, it's very easy, or not easy, but one can combine a biogeochemical carbon model with a physical model, run them out, and you'll get certain carbon responses. But it's very hard, it's very easy possibly to get the right answer for the wrong reason. So to try and decouple some of the physical and biological responses, it's very useful to use various frameworks to untangle what's going on. So a viewpoint that's been taken up by the biogeochemical community is really thinking about a ventilation picture where the nutrient in the mixed layer is referred to as the preformed nutrient that then is subducted or transferred into the main thermocline. And in the interior, any nutrients that we see there, we can split into a preformed and then a part that's being set by the biological regeneration, so the regenerated. So this has been nicely set out by Taka Ito, who's here, and Mick follows, where they spoke about the efficiency of the biological transfers in terms of the ratio of the regenerated phosphate to the total phosphate. And this is from climatological data, but this is a Atlantic section, and you can see that this ratio is about 0.3 over the Southern Ocean sector. So the biology isn't operating at full efficiency at all. You can take this framework view further, and so this is work by Alessandro Tagliabue. And so this is a viewpoint of how is, given that the biology isn't operating at full efficiency, what then is constraining it? One view is that it's the delivery of iron to the system. This is the entrainment flux of dissolved free iron into the winter mixed layer. What you can then do is try and understand where that iron is coming from. And again, you can use this framework view. You can split the iron up into preformed, regenerated, benthic sources coming from hydrothermal or sediments minus the scavenging. And what we find is that the iron in the Southern Ocean is either preformed and probably being transferred there from other basins, or there's a benthic source, which in this case is being dominated by the hydrothermal. So using these frameworks, we can get clues as to what the relevant pathways are and how the system is being controlled. Now we can transfer this approach to any biogeochemical quantity. And so for dissolved organic carbon, we can define the preformed dissolved inorganic carbon. Within the mixed layer, we can actually split that, if we so wish, into a saturated part where the carbon is in equilibrium with the atmosphere, plus a disequilibrium part. And some people would go further and split that into the anthropogenic. And then in the ocean interior, we can think of that interior carbon in terms of this preformed and regenerated. And again, we can subdivide that. So this framework can be used to try and understand the response or how the carbon distribution is being controlled. So what are the key points so far? From Andy, we met this residual circulation view, and no doubt there's something similar going on for the nutrient and carbon parts of the system. I think the air-sea carbon uptake is really going to be affected by how far surface waters are away from saturation. The air-sea exchange is going to occur on annual and longer timescales. In many ways, we might expect this preformed and regenerated responses that we see in nutrients and also carbon often to have slightly opposing responses. So what I want to do now is illustrate some of this framework approach via some work that John Lauderdale did using the MIT biogeochemical model. And what we did was to consider changes in the surface forcing, mainly the wind forcing. So this is focusing on the upper cell, and then look at the different responses. So the case I'll illustrate is one where we blew simply a stronger wind on there, and that strengthened the residual circulation. And in this case, we had a fixed Gent-McWilliams transfer coefficient, though I'll show some cases where that does vary. With this stronger overturning, effectively we ended up with a thicker thermocline in the system. So what do we then get? If we look at it in terms of this framework, we see a first order opposing response. Stronger winds, very simply, stronger winds, stronger residual circulation, stronger subduction. There's a greater transfer of preformed nutrients and carbon into the ocean interior. So the preformed carbon anomaly is positive in this problem. In turn, the regenerated carbon anomaly decreases due to more of those surface nutrients being subducted. So there's this opposite sign. If we wish, we can split this up into two parts. We can see that this preformed part of the carbon, the saturated part, has reduced because we've got a warmer thermocline, and so the saturated part of that carbon anomaly is decreased. Because we've got faster transit times at the surface, the disequilibrium has also increased. And so we get these partial compensation between these different terms. When John repeats this work from 27 different experiments with different strengths of winds, different transfer coefficients and so on, a deceptively simple result emerges that as the residual circulation increases, atmospheric CO2 increases. So the stronger residual cell is leading to more deep waters being brought up to the surface and more outgassing, more contact effectively of that deep carbon reservoir with the atmosphere and increasing atmospheric concentrations. In many ways, that might be consistent with paleo arguments about enhanced upwelling during the last deglacial rising CO2.
Rick, what is the precise measure of the overturning cell? Is it the upper cell here? Because there's a lower cell as well, which
Yeah. John's done it two different ways. So one is the strength of the upper cell. The other is also including a measure of the actual upwelling as well. And you can get slightly different results for some of these relationships. So, but let's go through that later. It doesn't change. All those choices alter some of the degrees of fit, but the first order response.
Upwelling rate, we can think of
Yeah.
as the upwelling rate.
You could also get a similar relationship from wind work. So whether this is the causal connection or whether it's some, obviously I think this has to be playing a role, but it's these sorts of integral connections I think we need to interrogate further. So John has repeated this work with different eddy closures, and for the case of stronger winds, they actually make hardly any difference. What this plot is showing is the atmospheric CO2 change, the preformed carbon and the regenerated carbon. When presented this way, there are only detailed variations. What we're seeing is an opposing sign of the regenerated and preformed carbon anomalies, the green and yellow being opposite here. And basically, the atmospheric CO2 increase is due to a contraction of that regenerated pool. That carries over, you get the opposite signs with the weaker winds, as you might expect. If we try southward shifts or northward shifts, the results start to differ slightly, though. Particularly the northward shift, we find that the constant eddy closure coefficient, it looks as an outlier compared with these three other cases. Again, we're generally getting opposing signs of these anomalies, but also that the dominant role alters slightly, that the atmospheric CO2 is increasing when the preformed is contracting. I think the answer here is that this is a complicated problem involving both physics and the biology, and whilst one would like to seek as simple a controlling view as possible, this problem is difficult. So in terms of the wider implications then, I think what we'd all agree is the Southern Ocean is probably playing a crucial role in the sequestering of heat, as Andy showed in some slides, and anthropogenic carbon. Now, what I'd like to do for the rest of my time is just, in some sense, it might seem an aside, but I'd like to argue that this is very important for the global climate system. One of the most important results from the IPCC report was this response of climate models that the surface temperature anomaly is broadly related to how much carbon we're emitting into the system. And what's more, there's only a small sensitivity to the different emissions. I will argue that this result is reflecting a first-order control by the ocean of how heat and carbon are taken up in the system. And by implication, the Southern Ocean is playing an important role in affecting this relationship. So how this is kind of expressed within the climate community is that one's trying to understand the link between cumulative carbon emissions and surface warming. And so that community talks about the transient climate response to emissions. So you can think of that very simply as we've got a global temperature change and a change in how much carbon we've, since the pre-industrial that we've emitted. And you can relate that by this differential. But to understand this response, I think you can break the problem up very usefully into two separate processes. There's one process which involves how the system, how the surface warming depends on the radiative forcing from carbon dioxide. And then there's secondly, a dependence of the radiative forcing on the carbon emissions. So that differential we can now split into these two terms. Simple rewriting the problem. And I want to now step through how I think the ocean is affecting each of these. And in my more specialized lecture later in the week, I'll actually try and derive these quantities. But this work is with Phil Goodwin and came out this last month. It turns out this warming dependence of the radiative forcing from carbon dioxide, you can rewrite as a climate parameter, which is related to the climate sensitivity, times 1 minus n star, where n star is a normalized ocean heat uptake. It's actually the global heat uptake divided by the radiative forcing. This term, how the radiative forcing depends on how much carbon we emit, depend on two quantities which are constant in time: a sensitivity of radiative forcing to CO2, which Keith Shine's work has quantified is simply 5.35 watts per meter squared. And something that we've worked on and identified as important is the buffered carbon inventory of the atmosphere and the ocean, which again is approximately constant over plausible emission scenarios up to 4,000 petagrams of carbon. This last term is a normalized ocean carbon undersaturation. So it measures how far the ocean is away from a carbon equilibrium with the atmosphere. So this relationship between global surface temperature change and cumulative carbon emissions is given by the product of these two terms. So we've written down this equation, and I'll show you at the end a test that it does work. But I want to try and then use that to explain how things should vary in time. So let's deal with the first part of the problem. How does surface warming vary in time? If we've increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, that's leading to increased warming. The actual surface warming is rather modest to begin with, because a lot of that heat is going into the ocean interior. As we progress forward in time, and that heat uptake reduces for the same fixed radiative forcing, that warming will increase in time. So the surface warming increases, this term here, circled in red, increases in time as the ocean heat uptake weakens. If I move to this second term, how does the radiative forcing from CO2 vary? Initially, if we've emitted a load of carbon, we've got a large excess of CO2 in the atmosphere, leading to a large amount of radiative forcing. And the ocean is grossly undersaturated in carbon. In time, the ocean will take up that carbon, and that will then have to reduce the radiative forcing from CO2. So the radiative forcing from carbon dioxide will naturally decrease in time due to this ocean uptake. Also, the terrestrial uptake will also act in a similar way. So these two terms partially, not exactly, but partially compensate for each other. And if we test this by putting this into a simple model, we find that this slope of how the temperature change relates to how much carbon we emit is nearly constant. Not exactly, but nearly constant. So why is there this similarity? It's because of the things that I touched on at the start. The way heat is getting into the ocean and the way that carbon or anthropogenic carbon is getting into the ocean, to first order is similar. That it's both transfers are involving, to first order, a ventilated transfer of those anomalies. So as we progress in time, the thermocline will warm up, and heat uptake here will cease. In the similar way, the upper ocean will become more saturated. There are some interesting differences. Heat and carbon sequestration need not be the same because of the complexities that we're aware of, the biology and the air-sea transfer timescales. But it's the similarity of these processes that is then leading to this important first-order climate response from ocean ventilation. That the take-up of heat and carbon at first order, I would argue, is occurring in a similar manner, and that's then leading to this response as suggested in climate models. There can be a mismatch, but I think that's the area that we should be trying to address and understand. So in terms of the challenges, I think we'd all agree with the apple pie statement, the Southern Ocean is likely to be crucial in sequestering heat and carbon. The rate limiting processes are relatively unclear. I would argue it's involving that seduction into the main thermocline versus the entrainment into the winter mix layer. And it's that mismatch that is driving the air-sea transfers. The residual circulation is probably our first point of, first dynamical way of trying to constrain the system, though I fully agree with the caveats raised that its links to the carbon transports are unclear because it's just the same as the meridional overturning circulation is not the same as northward heat transport. And that could be even more the case with carbon transfer. And I would argue that the global climate implications are quite important, that the degree by which the ocean takes up heat and carbon are affecting this relationship that we're seeing between global warming and carbon emissions. And the Southern Ocean is particularly important here in being one of the prime ventilation sites. And so the degree of this connection or the mismatch between those connections, I think, merit further study. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.